Happy New Year. Welcome to a new year of Planetary Calendar for 2018. We're Ralph and Lahni D'Amicis, and we have an announcement to make as well. We gave birth to a new calendar. Well, not really a new calendar, but a new size.
Yes.
And instead of having a little baby calendar, we gave birth to a new giant one. So now we have 3 sizes. The best part about this is that it's so much bigger and easier to read that Ralph is going to read his very own forecast.
Yes, yes. I get to read. Oh, Lonnie's always read the forecast, but I get to read it this year. Because also, we'll see as the year goes on, though.
Well, it doesn't matter. We both need to use cheaters in order to read it. But
that's true.
We'll see whether he can do it with this one.
Okay. And remember, the forecast, you can also go online to spaceandtime.com, this month's forecast, and see the details that are included here that are part of the calendar. The forecasts are complicated. They take a lot of work to do, but there's always much more within the forecast than you actually think.
And I always enjoy reading his great words, but when he reads it in his own pentameter, it's just even better.
Oh, yes. So Happy New Year. So, January 2018. Boom! The year begins with a full moon on the 1st with the toughies, Mars and Saturn, in powerful feminine rulerships. So expect the Martian steely aggressiveness and the Saturnine conservatism to be fully in command. This year is not starting off full of sweetness and light. The only buffers are the full moon in her rulership Cancer and Sirius Venus conjunct Sun in Capricorn, which further empowers this feminine theme, while humanizing the influences. Our advice? Seek and make protective alliances. These are serious times, but let Mercury and Sagittarius help you retain your sense of humor and optimism. On the 2nd, Uranus goes direct conjunct the asteroid Pallas, the advocate. So amid the restrictions, there will be brave advocates speaking up. On the 6th, that's a white circle day, and it comprises wonderful aspects to help push any project ahead. On the 8th and 9th, that marks the center of an overwhelming convergence of aspects followed by turbulence from Mercury entering Capricorn on the 10th. Even though the aspects are mostly positive, the black box day is there because of the cacophony of voices fighting to be heard. Both the full moon and the new moon on the 16th contain themes of health, medicine, reproductive rights, and partnership, especially on the West Coast. On the 17th, Venus enters Aquarius, cooling relationships, but leading the Sun when he enters Aquarius on the 19th. Venus supercharges the feminine advocacy that infuses this entire month. On the 26th, Mars enters optimistic Sagittarius, while the Sun trines the Gemini moon, so things lighten up and move forward. On the 31st is the full moon eclipse. This is a blue moon, with Mercury entering Aquarius, which is a brilliant position. This creates a balancing act between personal belt tightening and determined global transformation.
Easy for you to say. And of course, if you're reading along with this, you see the bolded letters with the asterisk, and they're meant for you to transfer that information down to the calendar part from the forecast part. And that will show you what days. If you find the A up here, you'll look for it down here. And those are the dates that he's talking about in this wonderful forecast. We started to footnote this calendar a couple of years ago, and so many people have told us how helpful it is. So we appreciate your feedback, and we're glad that you're enjoying that.
Yes. So, as we said, these are serious times, and we're actually, moving towards by 2020, the conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter that happens essentially every 20 years, where everything kind of compresses a bit. But this is really, as Saturn has gone into Capricorn recently. Its ruling sign is there for 2.5 years, and this is always a time of great practicality, you might call it. Yes.
Well, and Ralph said, boom, the month starts out with a bang. With that full moon on the first, so you're not kind of easing into the month at all. And then Uranus goes direct on the 2nd.
Right.
But I really like at the end of the week, kind of the reward for that is that nice white circle day. And just to remind you, white circle days are good days to get things started because it means you've got a lot of support from all of the energies that are available to you. And in this case, it's a nice industrious Virgo moon. And the moon is in a good aspect with all of those planets that are highlighted above the number 6. You know, so Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto are all enjoying a good aspect relationship with the moon. So you've got that emotional support, especially if your ruling sign is one of them. And then those aspects above the line are also supportive aspects. Particularly, people are going to like that Mars conjunct Jupiter because people just love Jupiter. The sign of optimism and luck and expansiveness and openness and all of that. And when you've got Mars there, conjunct that, it gives your energy a real positive avenue. And then that Mercury trine Uranus and the Sun trine Moon, everybody's kind of playing nice together. And as long as you get it started before 7 o'clock p.m. on the coast, that's when the void course starts. So all day long, you've got really great supportive features to begin any kind of thing that you want to get it off to a good start.
So the 6th is a good day for a wedding because with that moon in Virgo, that promotes fertility. The Sun trine Moon, it means there's a good harmony between the male and the female components. And
I know you say the moon in Virgo promotes fertility, but I like the moon in Virgo for other reasons, for a relationship or a partnership, because it means that emotionally you're paying attention to all the details. And if both people in the couple are doing that by virtue of the fact that that's the wedding date in this case that we're describing, you know, it means that I take care of you and you take care of me and it works out well.
Exactly. Now, the next thing that comes up is on the 9th, and that's a black box day. Now, it's not the classic black box day because there's so many planets above the lines and above the number. It's more so that there's so many aspects going on over a course of several days that it just overwhelms. That's what we're saying. There's so many voices at work there that it's hard to make yourself heard. And that's why it's really been denoted as a day that could be challenging on the 9th.
Cacophony is the feature there.
And on the 10th, the Mercury changes sign. And whenever Mercury changes sign, there's turbulence. There's bumps in the road.
Well, and I wanted to mention the 8th, which is actually the kicking off point to all this turbulence, because that started off with that Sun-Moon square as being the underneath the lines for the challenging aspects, and you also had that Libra moon with the aspects to Venus and Pluto being a little bit challenging. So when you start off that with all that energy, and all that energy just continues to build and grow, it can be supportive, but it also can be, like you said, disruptive, and you don't know kind of who to listen to, who to follow. So it's better to let that calm down just a little bit. Exactly.
Yes. Like I said, a lot of aspects. That the Sun conjunct Pluto and Venus conjunct Pluto on the 9th. That's a very indrawing kind of power,
And I think we say this every time, but a black box day doesn't mean it's a bad day. It doesn't mean go back to bed and pull the covers over your head. It means that you're not going to necessarily get the support or the help or the result that you want when you're beginning new projects or you're furthering things along. There's just too many variables to be certain that it's going to be smooth sailing.
Exactly. And then the month winds down towards the 16th at new moon. And remember, this is the new moon in Capricorn, so it's really a winter moon. The Capricorn moon is really a winter moon. Capricorn is considered one of the weaker positions for the moon, so you really enter the deep part of the year. But then the next year, the next day, Venus enters Aquarius, which is a very social position. It's not a romantic position in the least, but it is very social, and so if you really felt like you're not getting enough social contact, really use that Venus in Venus in Aquarius for the rest of the month to get yourself out there, to get involved in social events and also maybe community projects, things in which you're participating, because people will be very open to that kind of thing. Anything with a nonprofit would be a great time to promote that once Venus goes into Aquarius, and it remains there throughout the rest of the month.
Aquarius certainly is group participation. It's not, one-on-one relationships, but it's how you relate to like your larger group. So think about group activities.
And then on the 19th, the sun goes into Aquarius, and realize that this was traditionally the time of year when people really had to cooperate a lot, because you're in the deeper part of the winter. The food supplies are getting a little tight for people, so they start sharing back and forth. We have a family here that's not doing well. What can we do to help them? Who here has extra resources? And that's why that Aquarius section has a lot to do with people working cooperatively. And that starts on the 19th. And then on the following 26th, you have Mars enter Sagittarius. Now Mars has been in his feminine ruling sign of Scorpio. It's a very powerful position. So all the way through January, people really have been able to kind of like take a beat on stuff and move things forward. And suddenly Mars has gone into Sagittarius.
Which Mars likes Sagittarius.
Yes.
I mean, but it opens up to new possibilities.
Yes.
So instead of being laser focused on where you're going to put your energy, now you've got this new kind of horizons to explore. And, it's a good sign for Mars because Sagittarius rules the muscles, and Mars is an active sign, and, you've been maybe laying low, and your Mars energy has been internalized a little bit in that feminine sign, as feminine signs like to do. So now it's kind of get out there and put those great ideas that you had in Mars and Scorpio into physical action.
Exactly, and there's a sextile between Sagittarius and Aquarius after all, so there's a nice harmony between Sun and Moon, and on the day when this switches on the 26th, there's a trine between the Sun and the Moon in Gemini. So it's a generally positive day, though it is now moving up towards the full moon, which is on the 31st, and that one happens to be a total eclipse. Ta-da!
Therefore, it's a little bit of a black box.
Yes. And it then is going to start a 2-week period of time between that eclipse and the next eclipse, which is going to be, it's always problematic. It's always emotionally intense.
Well, people say, oh, the eclipse is going to be a hard time. It's a tough thing. And, for a lot of people, it's viewed as problematic. But for some people, they realize maybe after the fact that it is eye-opening. It's life-changing. The eclipse, it happens at the full moon. It brings things to light. All the things that you've been wondering about, worrying about, not sure about. Here comes the eclipse and says, aha, this is what's going on, And so it can be very disturbing at the time that it's going on, but once you get through that and you get a chance to process the information that came up out of that, it's up to you to move it into a positive direction.
Exactly. And actually the next eclipse is on the 15th. It's the new moon of February. It's the new moon in Aquarius, and it is the Chinese New Year, which is the most celebrated holiday in the year, in which we actually do a forecast for the entire year based upon that. So where we could turn the page right now and look next month, but you're going to have to watch next month's forecast if you want to see what's going on, and go online and check it out. And if you have the calendar, you can turn the page yourself and look ahead. So January is quite a month.
Get on the roller skates. Don't be a shrinking violet, as the Aquarian energy takes on. Get yourself out.
Yeah.
Make those connections. Meet those people. Do good out in the community.
Maintain that sense of humor. Very, very important.
Well, Mercury in Sag will help with that.
Yes.
So, thanks for joining us. So now, Ralph and Lahni are going to do their usual 1 minute or 10 about some astrological insights.
Yes.
And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about calendars in general. Why do we use the calendar that we have now? What other calendars are used by other people in other cultures or have been historically? And what does the calendar mean?
Right. And this is going to be significant for us because we are working on our Chinese New Year forecast, and we do a global forecast. It's positional. It's based upon different positions around the world, locations around the world, and we base it upon the chart for the new moon in Aquarius, which is the Chinese New Year, which is, as far as we know, the most widely celebrated holiday in the world, because the great majority of the population in the world is in Asia. About 1 in every 5 people on the planet are Chinese, and then you add all the other Asian cultures, and that is the most important holiday. And of course, we live in the North Bay, area north of San Francisco, and believe me, in San Francisco, the Chinese New Year is a big holiday. I mean, there's more that goes on there than I think during Christmas in some ways.
And it's fun and it's exciting, but a lot of people don't know why the Chinese New Year changes its date. But as Ralph said, it's determined by when the new moon in Aquarius falls. And when you think about the circle of the signs, the sun rules Leo. And that means that the sun gets to be the most sun-like. The opposite sign of Leo is Aquarius. Right. So it gets to be the least sun-like. That's when we have the least sun on us.
In the northern hemisphere, yes.
That's true. Northern hemisphere. So in any case, then when you have the moon conjunct the sun, which is the new moon, then all of that energy is sort of withdrawn. And it's an end point, but then it's a beginning point for new energy to start to build. So we use that as a more realistic starting point for a new growth cycle or a new year's growth than the Julian calendar or some other calendars that have been used historically.
Exactly. And in fact, we currently, of course, in the West use January 1st as the beginning of the calendar year. But traditionally, the actual beginning of the calendar year was actually April Fool's Day during Roman times. And that was based upon the fact that it was the first day of spring. So basically the springtime equinox. And over a period of time, the calendar shifts. Every day, the year is not exactly 365 days, and so the calendar shifts every year. So over the years, it's moved over, and of course, the calendar we're using currently is, several months away from the springtime solstice. But this was the tradition, the springtime solstice. But we use what we have. But other cultures around the world use different calendars. What's interesting with the Chinese New Year calendar is they don't really call it the New Year per se. They call it the Springtime Festival. They see it as the beginning of the year because it's the time in which the seeds will begin to sprout. After that point, the seeds will begin to sprout and there will be new growth. Before that point, not so much. And that's, once again, in the Northern Hemisphere. What's interesting is that it lands at different times of the year. It can run, and remember, Leo is in the middle of the summer, right? It runs from, from
middle of July,
about the 20th of July to middle of August when Virgo begins. And then Aquarius is the opposite time of the year, the deepest part of the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. Well, it can be, the new moon can appear at any time within there, all the way from January, from about the 21st of January up until about the 20th of February. And I think this is the idea behind the groundhog, whether or not we're going to have an early spring. Well, if the new moon is early in that thing, well, then that's going to be an early spring. The seeds are going to sprout early. If it's going to be late in the 30 days, cycle, then it's going to be a late spring because the seeds are going to sprout after that new moon. This is a triggering part. In many ways, it's actually a wonderful way to measure the year because it is the grounding point. It's the point in which all the energy of the earth most withdraws. And in fact, every year we do this, we always send out a picture of us balancing an egg on end. It is one time of the year in which you can easily balance an egg on end. And we do it every year. Take a picture, put it up on social media, on the website, and wherever. And it works very consistently.
We know that you can balance an egg on end at a time that you have enough patience for it.
Yes.
But it's just an easy time, and it kind of shows you that way the energy flow helps you to do that.
So what does this tell us, though? Well, it tells you the starting point for the year. And the interesting thing about it is that the oldest methods of astrology were location-based. And if you go back to the most ancient forms, the most ancient history of this, it was actually where they would lay out properties, and they would line them up with certain planets, the rising of certain planets, and then they would leave at the corner markers the planet, a block, and in it would be carved the symbol for that planet. So the original systems of astrology, which is geometry, were about laying out properties, and a lot of this goes back to ancient Egypt and goes back to the Sumerians and also to the Greeks, where agriculture was so important that they needed to know whose property was whose. You know, how do you designate whose property is, and that's, you know, early land planning basically comes from that same method. Well, even today, astrology is locational. Astrology is based upon where you are. In other words, when we do a chart for someone, some client calls up and says, "Oh, I'd like to have a chart done." They say, "Well, when are you born?" They'll say, "Well, you know, the date and then the time, as close as we can get." And then we say, "Where were you born? What's your location?" And when we go into our into our computers, it will tell you right down to the hospital. And it's very important. If you were born, you know, we find out, "Oh, I wasn't born, in New Mexico. I was actually born in New Jersey." Well, you've got a completely different chart.
Well, and even these days, it's also important to know where they're living now.
Right.
Because your chart kind of relocates when you relocate.
Yes.
So there's very interesting things, like when we do solar returns, we need to know where you're living currently as opposed to where you were born, so that you can, sometimes we look at the solar return calculated for where they were born and where they were living, just to see if there's some traces of that original program that are at play in the solar return for the year ahead.
There was actually a very important astrologer who, when computers finally allowed us to calculate these things, developed an entire system called astrocartography that would allow you to look at a person's chart and then see where the planets were angular around the globe. And we started realizing at that point that when you went to these areas where a particular planet was angular, there would be actually a line drawn on the globe, their experience would change. And what would happen was that particular planet would become very active in their life. And it would, and there's 4 different ways in which things become active in your life. They become active into your life personally, which is the rising sign, as we call it, or in terms of your partnerships, which is the descending, right? It's opposite the rising, or in terms of your career, like the flag above your head, or in terms of your home life, which is the point below your feet. So you have 4 different types of lines for each one of the planets. So if you went to some place, for instance, where you had Jupiter overhead, which you didn't where you were born, suddenly you'd find that your career very much expanded in a very Jupiterian kind of way, in an optimistic, beneficial way. On the other hand, if you moved to some place where the sun was overhead, you would become much more visible to people. Or if you moved to where the sun was below your feet, you would suddenly very much feel at home. Or the moon below your feet, where you would feel very, very much at home. And this is something that's really fascinating to work with. Like I said, it was developed by an astrologer in San Francisco. Once computers allowed these kind of calculations to be made easily, because they're actually much harder to calculate than a standard chart, which is hard enough to calculate. I mean,
you notice he picked all the nice kind of
Yes.
aspects of changing your planetary
Yes.
lines to something that's more beneficial. This is spoken by a person who lived on his Pluto line for
Yes.
most of his life. So we took care of that when we moved from coast to coast.
Yes.
So, there are things that you can do to bring the energy of these lines to you if you can't move, or sometimes, as the Chinese say, of the 50 ways to avoid trouble, the best one is to leave.
yeah.
So.
And people's experience of particular places are very unique to them based upon this pattern. So when we do the Chinese New Year forecast, we actually look at the chart, but then we look at the chart around the globe.
Located everywhere.
Because not everyone,
Major
not
cities.
every country, and not every city is going to have the same experience of that chart, where it is landing. And this is where what's called the houses come in. The houses, as you basically take the world around you and you break it up into 12 areas, and it's the 12 areas of your life. So, for instance, when you have, to get back to the sun overhead, if the place where the actual Chinese New Year takes place, where that new moon is directly overhead, you're going to see a lot of focus on that particular spot in terms of how chart plays out this year. If you have Saturn overhead, the planet, that area will probably go through compression, which is what Saturn does. It compresses.
And we often see where that sun-moon conjunction is directly overhead, that country, that culture is a primary sort of newsworthy feature of the whole year.
Yeah, and so it's very subtle, because after all, you know, Jupiter overhead when Jupiter's in Scorpio is very different than when Jupiter's in Sagittarius. It's two different flavors. It's two different experiences. Or Jupiter in Capricorn, or, you know, it's a very different experience. Venus is generally seen as a beneficial line, and yet sometimes when people move to their Venus lines, it makes them very self-indulgent.
They can't get anything done.
Right.
It's a great place to go on vacation.
Right. They love living there. People are really, really nice to them, but they're really not the most effective. It's not an aggressive position at all. Where if you move to some place which is very martial, it's on the Mars line, you'll get a lot of stuff done, but you may have quite a few bruises from it at the same time.
I can attest to that.
There you go. And that's where these calendars become important, because even though we live our lives according to our meeting planner and our schedules and things like that, there are celestial calendars, there are celestial markers that clock that goes on behind the scenes that help, you know, affect the weather, affect our bodies, affect our body clocks, that are influencing us all the time.
Calendars are just ways to count a cycle. You know, to divide a cycle into parts that are manageable for us.
Right.
I'm a numbers girl, so I happen to love the numbers, but, you know, if you can break down a period of time into usable parts, it makes planning and your progress a little easier.
Which is why every year we always buy a new calendar.
And that's another Astrological Minute, or 10, from Ralph and Lahni D. Mikas.